When someone tells me that they're worried about spending money in retirement, what they usually say is that they're concerned about running out. So I started asking people what that actually looks like. Picture it for me. What's the day you're actually afraid of? And they almost always describe the same thing. Balance sheet net worth goes to zero. They get an account statement in the mail with a big fat zero in it. They're 88 years old. There's nothing else coming in and there's nothing they can do about it. I've been a financial planner here in California for a long time. I've designed hundreds of retirement income plans for people and families, and I want to tell you something about that day. For most people watching this, the day that you're describing and thinking of and fearful of is really much less likely and actually looks a lot different than you think. Not because you've saved enough or not because the markets cooperate, it's because of how your retirement income is designed. Now, something else can happen, something real that I'm not going to talk you out of because you should plan for it, but it's much smaller than that thing in your head. And by the end of this video, you'll be able to measure it. There's a calculation you can run on your own numbers. It only takes about a minute, and it will tell you what it genuinely costs you when you run into a terrible market. Not out of your portfolio, but out of what you spent. When people run it in my office, there's always a big long pause because it's nothing like what they expect. So first, I'll show you why the picture in your head doesn't quite match the retirement that you've built. And then the arithmetic underneath it, which isn't me reassuring you, it's just how the numbers work. Then we'll run your number. And at the end, what it's costing you to keep worrying about the wrong thing because it's not free. And if you'd like to chat with someone about how your own retirement income is set up, there's a link in the description. You can book a call with me and my team. We look at this stuff all day, every day. Now let's talk about where that picture of retirement came from. And I want to be fair to that picture of retirement because it's not irrational. For 40 years, running out of money meant something very specific in your life. The account balance was low, the bills keep coming, and the only thing standing between you and a whole lot of trouble was that next paycheck. That was true. When you're working, your income comes from one stream only, your paycheck. And if that stops, everything stops and you can find yourself in some serious trouble. So you spent 4 decades of your career building and carrying this mental model of what running out of money looks like. And then you retired and carried that same model into a phase of life that's built completely differently. Because while you're working, if your income went to zero, if your employer lets you go, your income goes to zero, that's a cliff. In retirement, most people have something underneath them kind of buffering the foundation of their income plan that doesn't stop and isn't based at all on the market. That's a floor. A floor is not a cliff. And when things go badly with the floor, you land on it, not crash through it. That single difference is why the day you're picturing doesn't work the way you think. But to see it, we have to be precise about what your income is made from because most people have never separated that out. Almost everybody I talk to thinks of their retirement in the terms of one number, their monthly spending. I need $8,000 a month, and that's going to come from my money. But it doesn't all come from one place. It comes from 2 places, and they're nothing alike. The first part is your floor. And on your floor, that's money you're going to receive every month, regardless of what the markets do. For most people, that's Social Security. Pay into the Social Security system. At some point, you get a benefit later. It's guaranteed by the Social Security Administration every month. For a lot of people, especially in the public sector here in California where I live, it's a pension. If you're a state public employee or maybe a teacher in the teaching system, you might fall under CalPERS or CalSTRS. For a lot of people, it's a combination of those two or perhaps some kind of annuity income. Whatever the source, what matters is what it does. When the stock market falls 30%, your floor doesn't change at all. It's not invested in anything you own. It shows up every single month regardless. The second part is the slice on top. That's whatever your portfolio has to supply to cover the gap between your floor and what you want to spend every single month. And that part does move with the markets because that's where your portfolio, that's where your money is invested. Now, here's what people do, and I explained this badly myself earlier on in my career. When you imagine a market crash in your head, you picture your whole spending falling apart. $8,000 a month is all of a sudden entirely at risk. That picture is where the fear comes from. But the market can't touch your floor. It simply doesn't have any access to it. So whatever damage a crash does, it can only hurt the slice on top. And for a lot of people, that slice is a lot smaller than they think because the floor has been doing a lot more lifting than they ever realized. Let's say you want to spend $78,000 a year between the two of you, and your floor is providing $48,000 of that portion. That means that your portfolio only needs to provide $30,000 on top. That top portion is the only part of your spending plan that the markets can reach. So when you lie awake in bed at night worrying about a crash, you're worrying as if $78,000 is exposed. It's not. $30,000 is exposed. The other $48,000 is bolted down. That's your floor. Now, 2 things, because your floor might not be quite as strong as the one in that example. The first is that not every floor keeps up with inflation quite well enough. Social Security gives you a cost of living adjustment every single year that's supposed to keep up with inflation. Most public pensions give you a cost of living adjustment, give you raises each year, but a lot of private pensions don't. In a lot of private pensions, you get the same flat rate every month forever. It doesn't increase over time. Two different people can both have $48,000 of guaranteed income coming in and be in wildly different financial situations. Because if one person's rises with inflation, meaning that their purchasing power is steady over time and the other's doesn't, the pensioner that doesn't have the cost of living adjustment is only going to be able to buy less and less and less and less over time. The second is that some people have very little guaranteed income at all, and I don't want to talk past you. If you're self-employed or maybe relying on one Social Security benefit instead of two, or perhaps waiting until age 70 to file for benefits and collect a larger benefit, then you have less guaranteed income and more of your spending is exposed to the market because it is coming out of your portfolio, and that is certainly exposed to risk. That doesn't mean that this video isn't for you. It means that your personal numbers are going to be bigger than the numbers I'm going to go through in this video, and that's actually more useful to know than the alternative. So back to that day you were picturing. For your income to actually be zero, two things have to happen at the same time. The first is that your floor has to stop. And if your floor is Social Security, that means Social Security has to end. That program has its funding problems. I'm not going to pretend that they don't. But all the projections say that yes, Social Security benefits might need to get haircut a little bit if no changes are made, but the projections say that after some modest haircuts, if we don't make any other changes, there'll be enough coming in to pay like 80% or so of everybody's benefits for the next 75 years. Those are two very different things between your floor going down by a little bit and going away entirely. Now, if your floor is a pension instead of Social Security, then that pension has to fail. The second is that you have to keep pulling the same dollar amount out of your portfolio no matter what happens. And this is the one worth slowing down on because few people actually examine it closely. Most retirement math you see online works kind of like this. Pick a dollar figure and then increase it by the rate of inflation every year for about 30 years. 4% of $1 million is $40,000. So you start with $40,000 and then you bump it up by $1,000 every year. So 40,000, 41, 42, 43,000. And you take those amounts out of the account regardless of what happens to the balance. That approach can absolutely run dry. And that's precisely why. If the market cuts your balance in half and you keep taking the same amount out every single year, yeah, it's possible to work the balance down to zero. You're taking the same amount out of half the size. Do that for a couple of years consecutively and you dig yourself a hole you can't really come out of. But watch what happens if you take a percentage of what's there instead. Let's say you're taking 3% out of a $1 million account. So that's $30,000. Take $30,000 out of the account and then the market falls and your $1 million balance falls to $700,000. 3% of $700,000 is now $21,000. The withdrawal just got smaller by itself. Nobody needed to panic. Nobody needed to make a decision in the middle of a frightening week, and nobody had to sell any extra shares to hit some arbitrary target. And that's the part that I want you to sit with. A percentage-based withdrawal naturally adjusts with the market, making it a lot harder to deplete the account over time. This isn't just optimism, this is pretty basic arithmetic. You're taking a slice of what's there, and in any circumstance, no matter what, a slice of what's there is less than all of what's there. The balance can get uncomfortable, I won't tell you otherwise, but the method itself has no bottom because it keeps resizing itself based on what's actually there. So the day you're afraid of requires your floor to stop and requires you to continue withdrawing as though your balance never changes. And neither one of those components actually reflects your situation. What happens here is that that slice on top just gets smaller for a while, and that's real. So let's go measure it. Now, this takes about a minute, and I would encourage everybody to pause as we go along and actually go through this exercise. First, write down what you're spending in a year. What do you want to spend this year? Write that down. And then calculate what your floor is going to provide. So Social Security, any kind of pension income, annuity income, any of that. You subtract out what your floor is going to provide from what you want to spend, and bingo, that's what your portfolio needs to support. That's the slice on top. Now, cut your portfolio size by 30%. That's roughly what a bad bear market might do to your portfolio. Portfolio size, reduce it by 30%, take the same percentage out of that portfolio, and then add your floor back in. That's your bad year right there. And the number that you get from this is the whole point of this video, because this is your bad year. This tells you what you actually have. Let's use the numbers we were talking about earlier from our example. $78,000 a year of spending, $48,000 from our floor, which is Social Security, which means that we have $30,000 from our slice, right? That's what the portfolio needs to accommodate. Well, if the market falls, we still take out that 3%. 30,000 falls to 21,000. 21,000 plus 48,000 is $69,000. And so in this scenario, you went from 78,000 of spending down to 69,000 of spending. That's an 11% reduction in a year where the market fell by roughly 30%. 11%. That's the disaster. It's not destitution at 88. It's not living under a bridge eating dog food somewhere or your accounts being totally zeroed out. It's an 11% reduction in spending for a year or maybe 2 or 3. There have been bear markets that have lasted 4 years, with the difference coming out of not your essential expenses, but your discretionary expenses that you can tighten the belt on a little bit. And understand what I mean by disaster. This is the thing that people restrict their life for 20 or 30 years to try to avoid. That's what that trip, that vacation, that family time didn't happen for. Now let's run something with a smaller floor because plenty of you are there too. Same spending of $78,000, but instead of a $48,000 floor, we're going to use a $48,000 slice and a $30,000 floor. So maybe 1 Social Security benefit instead of 2, maybe a modest pension and no Social Security at all. The point is that more of the spending is going to come out of the portfolio. The slice is bigger than the floor is. Markets fall 30%. That $48,000 becomes about $33,600. We add that to the $30,000 floor. Now our spending goes down to $63,600, which is a reduction of about 18%. Bigger and still worth planning for, but look at what it isn't. It isn't the accounts going to zero. It isn't nothing coming in. And if you have essentially no guaranteed income at all, so your floor is 0, that 30% reduction from a fall in the market just comes straight through. Now this is serious and this definitely needs some planning work, but even here, the arithmetic describes a reduction for a series of years, not everything going to 0. So now run your version and look at your number. If it came out in the single digits or the low teens, you've been carrying a fear that just doesn't match your situation, and you can probably put most of it down today. Now, if it came out to 20 or 30%, you don't have a fear problem, you have a design problem. And design problems have solutions. That's what I want to talk about next. Either way, oftentimes this is the first opportunity or first time people have actually put the math to the fear that they're so concerned about. A number that you can look at is a completely different experience than a fear that you can't. Now, if you're running that calculation and you're not sure you have the right figures, or maybe you want to look at it over a 30-year time span instead of just 1 year, this is the kind of stuff my team and I do all day, every single day. There's a link in the description. You can click it. We're happy to go over your specific numbers with you. So the choice was never between spending the money or keeping it safe. The money was coming out either way. The only question is whether the money comes out on your terms, your tax rate, while you're able to use it, or somebody else's at their potentially higher tax rate. Not spending doesn't preserve it, it just hands that decision off to somebody who isn't you. So if the risk was never a zero balance, what actually was it? The real risk is that that cut arrives and you can't absorb it. That 11%, that 18% drop eats into something essential instead of discretionary. So you end up selling investments at the worst possible moment, or you make a permanent decision that solves a temporary problem. That's a completely different risk than the one that you've been carrying. And the useful thing about it is this is a risk that you can do something concrete about, which you can never do about the other one. Separate your spending into 2 buckets. The first one is the bucket of expenses that's going to go out no matter what. So your property taxes, your insurance, your healthcare, your groceries, utilities, that kind of stuff. The second bucket are the expenses that might go out but don't necessarily need to. That's the travel, that's the hobbies, that's the eating out, and those kinds of items. Now compare that first bucket against your floor. Now if your essential spending fits inside of your floor, look at what a bad market can actually reach. It's only the second bucket. Your house, your insurance, your food, your utilities, those are being paid by a floor that the market just has no access to at all. What you would adjust to in a bad year is how much you travel, how much you eat out, but not whether or not you're in your home. That's the difference between a pay cut and an emergency. And that's a design problem, not a market outcome. You can set that up on purpose if you want to. Now, if your essential spending sits above your floor, that tells you something specific. And it's not that you can't retire. It means that the levers that raise your floor matter a little bit more for you than they might for somebody else. The biggest one is usually when you file for Social Security. Every year you wait to file for Social Security, your benefit increases in an inflation-adjusted way permanently for the rest of your life. And usually when people debate this, they're arguing over break-even ages and life expectancy and those matters. That's fair, and I've certainly done that in the past. But there's a second thing that filing later does for you, and it's precisely what we've been talking about for the last 10 minutes. And that's that it increases the floor that the market cannot reach. And if your version is based on a pension, then what matters is how and when you elected to take it and what happens when one of you passes away first. A pension that stops at the first death is a whole lot different than a pension that continues for the surviving spouse. For some people, the honest answer is that closing the gap means adjusting which expense goes into which bucket, or maybe working a little bit longer. That's not something that anybody really wants to hear, but it is a concrete plan with steps, and that's better than carrying a fear and not having a way to put that fear down. Now, there's one more piece here, and it's what turns this from interesting into urgent. Most people see not spending as the free option. When you spend, that incorporates risk. When you don't spend, that's neutral. That's the safe version of this. So when you're unsure, you just don't spend. But not spending isn't neutral. Every dollar that you have in a traditional IRA or a 401k or another type of tax-deferred account is a dollar that you've not paid income tax on yet, and the IRS doesn't allow those dollars to sit in those accounts forever. Under the current rules, you're required to start taking money out of those accounts in the year you turn 75, whether you want to or not. The math is one step. You divide your balance in the account at the end of the previous year by your life expectancy, a divisor, a number that the IRS gives you. And in the year you turn 75, that number is 24.6. So on a $1 million account, you divide it by 24.6, that's roughly $40,000. And from that point on, the divisor gets smaller because your life expectancy goes down by about 1 year every year. As that divisor goes down, you're required to take out more and more of the account every year. And by the time you're 85 years old, you're required to distribute about 6% of the account. So the money that you didn't spend in your 60s doesn't stay unspent. It comes out later in bigger pieces when your Social Security benefits are already sitting underneath it on your tax return, and at a time when more income can increase what you need to pay for Medicare premiums. And if it doesn't come out during your life, it needs to come out during your kids. Generally, under the current rules, when your child inherits an IRA or a 401k from you, they need to empty the account inside of 10 years. They don't get to stretch it out over the rest of their life like they used to be. The rules have changed on this, and the account has to be zeroed out at the end of 10 years. And think about when those years might land. If you pass away in your 80s, your kids might be in their 50s, 60s, let's say. For a lot of people, those are their peak earnings years. And when the money comes out of the accounts that they inherit from you, they're paying tax on it at their rate, at the time in their life when they're paying the highest rate of income tax potentially. So let me put the whole thing in one place. The day that you're fearful of requires two assumptions to be true that don't really describe how most retirements actually work. One is that your floor just totally collapses. And then the second is that you keep withdrawing from your portfolio every year as if the balance never changes. What can actually happen is that the slice on top of your floor gets smaller in bad market years. And when you run that on your own numbers, it usually amounts to only a single digit or low double digit cut to your spending because the market only has access to the portion of your income that's invested. So the work really isn't building a bigger wall against a disaster that can't happen. It's making sure that the things you can't cut sit underneath your floor so that if you have to cut, that cut is on not the essentials, but the discretionary expenses that you can afford to live without. And meanwhile, the money you're leaving alone to protect yourself isn't staying put. It has a date on it. And that date arrives with a bigger tax bill attached. One more thing, and I say this to people in my office all the time. The things that don't happen in retirement are almost never big decisions. No one sits down and decides not to take the trip. What happens is hundreds of tiny, small moments where reflex says no before the arithmetic is ever consulted. And that reflex is the same instinct that built the account in the first place. So it's nothing to be ashamed of, it just doesn't know that the job has changed. So next time it fires, the question isn't whether or not you can afford it. You already know the answer. The question is whether you're saying no because of the money or because you've just never said yes. So that's the piece that I think takes most of the worry from spending in retirement. It's not a rule of thumb or somebody just telling you to loosen up. It's understanding what your income is actually made up of and what a bad year really costs you. But here's the thing. I mentioned earlier that the money in your tax-deferred accounts has a date on it. And there's one move that changes it entirely. You can choose to pay the tax on that money now on purpose at a rate you choose and take the IRS out of the equation permanently. It's a Roth conversion, which gets recommended to just about everybody these days, which is unfortunate because there are a lot of circumstances where it doesn't make sense. It only genuinely works when a specific number of conditions line up first. That's exactly what I break down right here, where I go through the 5 things that I want to look for before recommending that anybody convert a single dollar. I'll see you there.